I hope that was enough time for everyone. I wasn't sure if I should have given you a little bit more time or if you were all about done. So hopefully that was about right, at least. It was about the right length. So yeah, let's just work our way through these problems. Again, remember what you turn in today. I do need to see some kind of diagram, but it can be very rough and broad what that counts as. Some people I've seen take photographs of their answers and then just add it into the file. That's fine if you want to do that. I've seen some people do it through text files. Some people do it in Paint or MS Paint or something like that. However you want to do it, just as long as I can clearly understand what you're saying and clearly tell the difference between LinkedIn independent support. I'm fine with it. So yeah, let's start with the first problem I asked you all to look at. So a person should only tell the truth if it benefits them in some way. There is no moral obligation to be selfless, and telling the truth when it harms you is certainly being selfless. So the conclusion in this case here, we don't have any particular keywords to give away what's the conclusion. But I think the best way, indeed really the only way I think that the argument will make any sense, if we read this last sentence as the conclusion. Couple different justifications maybe we can give as to why that seems to be the conclusion. One reason perhaps is that that's certainly probably the most controversial claim. Right? You can lie if it helps you out in life. I think that would be a somewhat controversial claim. Also, we could say that sort of the other claims sort of seem to point back to this is what everything seems to be in service of, is establishing this claim as the conclusion. So once we have our conclusion, the rest of the standardization is easy. There's no moral obligation to be selfless. That's just the first premise that I see. Two, telling the truth when it will harm you is being selfless. And the reason why I broke this up, this is one sentence, but they're two different claims. And so that's why I've broken up the two different claims as sort of sentences of their own or as premises of their own, because we can evaluate the truth or falsehood of these claims separately. Just pause for a second. Everyone agree with me on the standardization? Feel free, unmute yourself. You should all have the ability. Send questions to the chat or whatever. At any point you want me to explain something I'm saying, let me know. I'm happy to do it. You're not going to be interrupting me. It's the whole point of doing this synchronized, that you can ask me stuff. All right, so if this is our standardization, then we've got to do the diagram for it. All right. So in this case, the question is, do these premises make sense individually, or do they sort of have to go together to give us to the conclusion? And in this case, I think like the one we first talked about, this seems to be an example of linked support. Telling the truth when it harms you is being selfless. That gives you, maybe put it this way, that's the conclusion has two parts: persons to telling the truth and benefits. This premise gives you the selfless part, or the benefiting you part. This premise gives you the that telling the truth is sort of an example of this general moral principle. So the two need to go together. The argument doesn't make sense if I treat them separately. I'm looking at link support. Questions, thoughts, comments? Everyone good with number one? All right. Let's look at number two then. See if I can. Nope, that didn't work. Try again. All right, let's look at the second one. Because of the constant instability in the region and the long-standing hostility of Pardinians, the foreigners, any peacekeeping force sent to Pardinia is doomed to fail. All right, here we actually do have a premise or conclusion keyword. This because indicates that what follows is likely to be a premise. And so it sort of suggests that this The constant instability of the region is a premise. Longstanding hostility of the Pardinians, the foreigners, are premises. And again, I think it also works for other reasons too. Presumably, these are sort of like factual claims that would be relatively uncontroversial in the world where Pardinia actually existed, whereas the claim that the peacekeeping force will be unsuccessful, that probably is more controversial. So again, we can do the standardization, put the conclusion on the bottom. Then put the premises in the order we see them. Note that in this case, I actually pretty substantially rewrote the first premise from how it's written. That as it's written, it's not even clear that it's a sentence, right? The constant instability of the region. So I sort of like filled in the gaps, right? There's constant instability in the region around Pardinia just to make it really clear what the claim actually is. Similarly, in this case, the second case, there is long-standing hostility of the Pardinians, the foreigners. And again, you're allowed to do this kind of rewriting so long as you're preserving as best as you can the sense of the original argument. All right. And so this is our standardization. Let's do the diagramming. All right, so the question again is, do these premises make sense individually? And in this case, they do. There is constant instability in the region around Pardinia, therefore the peacekeeping force is going to fail. That works. That does indeed seem like it's a reason to believe that the peacekeeping force, well, indeed might fail. Similarly, there is long-standing hostility of Pardinians, the foreigners, therefore a peacekeeping force sent to Pardinia will fail. Again, I think that makes sense individually. It gives you some degree of a reason to believe that those premises are true. So someone's asking in the chat, and it's a good question, which kind of support is the most common? There's not a hard and fast answer to that question because different kinds will be more common in different arguments. There's one kind of argument that's called the deductive kind of argument, that every argument will have a link support. Every deductive argument will have link support. In inductive arguments, you see probably independent is more common, but you certainly will see examples of link support in inductive arguments too. So there's not any one hard and fast answer I can give to which is more common. They're both going to occur a reasonable amount of the time. Yeah, but all deductive arguments, which we'll talk about next week, all of them will have link support at least. So that's probably not as helpful as you might like, but at the very least, that's the best I can give you at least anyway. Let's see. So now we said this is independent support. Draw the independent arrows up. One thing that I just want to emphasize, saying that these premises independently support the conclusion, it doesn't mean that the argument's not stronger with both of them there, right? You can think of it that each of these gives you maybe some percent chance that the conclusion is true. So maybe this one gives you a 25% chance. This one gives you a 25% chance. Together, they give you a 50% chance that the conclusion is true, right? So it's a much stronger argument if both of these were true. But even if you got rid of one, say there was no long-standing instability, you would still have some reason to think at least that the conclusion was true. Maybe just not a very good reason, but still you have some reason. Whereas, if you get rid of either of these two premises, you would just have no reason to believe that the conclusion was true whatsoever. They only really connect to the conclusion if taken collectively. How are people doing? Any other questions about number 2? Or number 1 for that matter? All right, great. Then let's jump to number 3. Number 3 is actually in some ways a little bit easier than some of these other ones that I gave you. Anytime you have sort of a numbered list like you do in number 3, it's almost certainly independent support. It's almost certainly, I'm saying each of those reasons is a independent reason to believe that the conclusion is true. And indeed, that's exactly what is the case. Come on, Zoom, stop being a pain. right. So let's pull up number 3. And so there are 3 very good reasons why the Gears of War games are terrible. You should expect right away that that's probably going to be your conclusion, right? I'm saying here are 3 good reasons to believe that this thing is true. This thing being true is almost certainly going to be the conclusion, and indeed nothing contradicts that in what we go on to read. First, the characters in those games all look like over-muscled giants. Second, the plots are always incredibly silly. Third, the gameplay is boring. The reason I gave you this one is it's a good chance to practice the standardizing a little bit, and a good opportunity to see how it can really be helpful in a lot of cases to sort of rewrite the premises or maybe even the conclusion to make the claim that's being made a little bit clearer. So the conclusion, the Gears of War games are terrible. Simple enough. Sorry for this example for any fans of the series, but yeah, we don't have to agree with an argument to analyze it. All right. So let's deal with the first premise. We'll list the premises in order. The characters in those games all look like over-muscled giants. Okay. Why is that a bad thing exactly, right? That doesn't seem super clear. Can we maybe like put that in different words to make the critique clear? Well, maybe something like the art design in the games is bad. That's a lot clearer. The problem is clearer. I mean, maybe someone likes over-muscled giants in the game, right? Like, so I mean, why is that bad? This way of writing it makes the critique a little bit clearer, a little bit more obvious. I think the same thing could be said in the second case. Second, the plots are always incredible silly. Well, if it's a comedy game, it's a good thing if you have silly plots, maybe, right? So the claim must be that the plots are bad or poorly written in some sense. Again, this way of rewriting it makes the critique just a little bit clearer, a little bit easier to see. Where did the rest of the... Yeah, there we go. And then for the third one, the gameplay is always boring. That one probably doesn't need to really be written. That critique is pretty clear. All right, so now same basic idea. We now have sort of 3 premises, but since that's not really going to change our operating procedure, we'll use the same procedure. Just have more premises to look at. All right. In principle, you can have any combination of supports here. So it's possible that maybe 1 was independent and 2 and 3 were linked. It's possible that all 3 of them could be linked. And it's possible that they could all be independent. That's true with all these. There's no sort of limit to how these things in principle could be defined or how they could be supportive. So we'll need to sort of look at them individually. And like I said, anytime you have a list like this, each reason kind of is being presented as if it was something that stood on its own. Right? The art, character design in the game is bad, so it's a bad game. Checks out. The plots are poorly written, bad game, checks out. Gameplay is boring, bad game, checks out. So here, in this case, we just see 3 instances of independent support. And again, notice what that tells us, right? We're not going to take argument. Our ultimate goal is going to be to analyze arguments, not just sort of diagram them. But this diagram sort of will help us quite a bit if when we start looking at the argument. If you are a fan of the Gears of War games and you want to say that the gameplay isn't boring at all, well, fine, that gives you useful information. We know that then you're going to argue that this third premise is false. But that doesn't mean you're still going to have to deal with the first and second premises. The first and second premises are independent of the third one. So if you think the third one is false, you still will have to deal with the first and second as things that are needed to sort of completely undermine or completely refute the argument. So this sort of helps us figure out how to go about approaching it and interpreting the arguments when we actually move to that step of the process. Again, how are we doing so far? Any questions with any of these first 3? Awesome. So let's then look at the principal charity problems. Probably those are comparatively simple, but still worth going over, confirming. Let's pull it up. All right. So let's look at the number 4. So comic books are basically about the triumph of traditional social norms over any form of deviancy. So the same thing is true of Green Lantern number 78. All right. The question in this case is, how should we standardize this argument? And if we have multiple possible ways that it could be standardized, what way should we go with? How should we read the argument if there's multiple options? And in this case, I think there are indeed multiple options. There's multiple ways that the argument can be read. We could read this first sentence, comic books are basically about the triumph of social norms over any form of deviancy. We can read this sort of as a kind of universal generalization. So all comic books are about this. Okay? And the sort of English as it's written supports that reading. Or we could read it as sort of suggesting that a great many of them have this property. Right? And so, as a result, we'd end up with different kinds of conclusions too. If we read this as a kind of universal generalization, like in this first case, we'd also read this conclusion as kind of a necessary conclusion. This would turn into what we'll call next week a deductive argument. Whereas if we read this with sort of this a great many, the conclusion becomes kind of probabilistic. It's also likely to be about rather than sort of certainly or necessarily about. This would become an example of what's called an inductive argument. Right? Which of these is more charitable? Which of these is sort of more likely to be a good argument? Well, in this case, probably the second one is superior. And the reason why in this case is it's far more likely that the first premise is true in the second case than in the first. To establish that really all comic books are about this, it would be enough if I found one single comic book that didn't have this structure, and it would destroy the entire argument. Whereas in this case, if I interpret the argument in this way, yeah, I could say that, yeah, there are some comics that don't have this, but just most of them have this. That's a far easier claim to defend. And so then the argument as a result will be a stronger argument. It'll be more likely to have a true conclusion. And since that's our goal when we're doing when we're using the principle of charity, it's not necessarily to ensure that the argument has a true conclusion, but just to present the strongest possible version of the argument that we can. The second is a stronger version of the argument. Every group agree? Anyone want to make a claim for number one? Now, we also have to be a little bit careful here. Maybe the person who made that argument really meant number one. And then we should go with that, right? If that's what they really meant, right, we should take it at their word, not distort what it was they're saying. But if we don't know which one they mean, then we should go with the more charitable one. That's sort of the idea here. It's not that we're sort of putting words in people's mouth. It's more that if someone's just being a little bit ambiguous, we're going to give them the benefit of the doubt, assume they mean the sort of more plausible thing rather than the less plausible thing. All right, let's look at number 4 real fast. Number 5 real fast, same lines. All right, so we have this argument, I hate taxes, I barely have enough money as it is, and then the government comes and takes what little I have left. We ought to do something about this. So this is an argument from my Uncle Joe. True story. All right, and we look at this, and my hope is that your sort of reaction is, this is a little ambiguous. My Uncle Joe seemed to mean a little unclear. Here, it's not so much the premises that are unclear, it seems to be the conclusion. Right? Because what's the conclusion? It says we ought to do something about this. Well, what ought we to do? What kind of claim is actually being advanced here? And so again, we'll have a same kind of idea, but now maybe we have a slightly different way that we'll sort of evaluate. So again, yeah, here are 2 possible versions I came up with for what my Uncle Joe might have meant. Maybe he meant many people like me can barely make ends meet. Taxes add an unsustainable burden to such people. Conclusion, the tax code is unfair and should be made fair. Or conclusion, taxes should be completely abolished and no one should pay anything to the government. Now, I know my Uncle Joe, so I know which of these he actually probably meant, but you all don't, so let's be charitable, right? Which of these conclusions is more likely to be true? In this case, I think we want to say standardization 1 is the superior one, right? Why? The conclusion is a less extreme claim. Indeed, I imagine almost everyone agrees that the tax code is unfair to some extent and should be made fairer to some extent. Right. So indeed, we might not even say it. We might even say that this version is almost not even super controversial. Perhaps we disagree about how it's unfair or about how it should be made fairer. But almost everyone, I imagine, thinks that there's something that could be tweaked to make the tax code better. It's a less extreme conclusion. Whereas taxes being completely abolished, that's a far more extreme conclusion. Now, it could be the case that someone means the more extreme conclusion, but the more extreme a conclusion is, the less likely it is to be true, and the more evidence that you'll have to supply to justify it. And again, that's not to say that extreme conclusions can't be true or that more higher orders of evidence can't be supplied to justify them, but it's more work. It's putting it a hard, the sort of, you want to put it this way, the burden of proof is far higher on an argument trying to establish this second conclusion than it is for the first one. And so again, the more charitable reading is probably the first one. Now, I can tell you my Uncle Joe actually probably meant the second one. Right? But I know him, right? So that's why I would make that conclusion. You all not knowing him, if you're being charitable, you should assume he means, the more moderate conclusion. And don't worry, he'll interrupt you and tell you if you're wrong, right? People are usually pretty good. If they mean the more extreme version, people are usually pretty good at telling you that that's what they mean. And actually, it can be a useful sort of strategy when you're talking to someone. If you assume they mean something more mild, frequently they weren't super clear themselves what they actually meant, and they'll end up meaning the more mild thing, the more defensible thing, the thing that has a higher chance of being true. So it's not even it's a good strategy sometimes to sort of, when you're maybe dealing with someone who you suspect maybe is tending toward more hyperbolic claims, to sort of assume they mean something a little bit more moderate, and they frequently will go along with it. Yeah, because they're not, people often clear themselves exactly what it is they mean all the time. People good with 4 and 5? Any questions there? All right, awesome. Then let's real fast end with the last problem. So this is our first instance of a harder diagramming problem. And the way that I sort of recommended you sort of talk your way through it is intended to help us get used to the more complicated kind of structure, the more complicated kind of format that we're going to start seeing. And what we'll do next time on Thursday is we'll spend the whole time just looking at 5 problems with about this level of complexity, about this level of difficulty. So you'll get a lot more practice with some of these harder problems next class session on Thursday. So whatever we do, the United States should not intervene in the affairs of Sardinia. First, it would be illegal. Legally speaking, the principle of national sovereignty requires every nation to refrain from interfering in the domestic affairs of other nations without consent. Besides, the situation of Sardinia is a mess of factions and long-standing grudges. Intervention would not make a positive difference in such a conflict. All right. So first question, what's the conclusion? And here, I think it's got to be this first sentence. I think this first sentence is the only one that really works as the primary conclusion for the argument. Everything else, we sort of give this, again, it's kind of a numbered list kind of deal, so that notice that should help us figure out what kind of support maybe we're looking at. We've got first reason, it would be illegal. Second reason, mess of factions, grudges. Right? Not going to work. However, we're going to break it down. Both of those seem like they're reasons to believe that we should not engage in intervention. So that would be our primary conclusion. And just writing that up, right, this looks pretty similar to what we've been doing so far. But the next step is where things are going to get more complicated and where I see students start to sort of make mistakes. So let's pause for a second. This is just some general advice that I've seen from students. When you are looking at a more complicated argument, what makes the argument more complicated is just that it's longer. That's actually it. There's just like more steps to it, basically. But you're all used to reading long stuff. Like, it's not like you all don't read long things all the time, right? But what you normally do that's different from what I see students do with a lot of these diagramming problems is normally you summarize the argument to yourself. You summarize what you read to yourself rather than trying to deal with every single sentence in the argument as it's written. And that's actually what I recommend you all do with these problems. Read the argument, but then almost like cover it up or put it away or something. Try to summarize the argument to yourself. What is this argument that I just read saying? And when students do that, I find they frequently put things in their own words, first of all, which, as we've seen, is fine. That's allowed for by standardizing. But also, they sort of hone in on the key important things way more clearly than they do if they're trying to just deal with the argument as written. So that's what was sort of the idea or the intention behind the way I sort of wrote this out. Let's almost now, we've got the argument as written, fine, we'll return to it eventually, but ignore it for a second, just block all that out. Why, according to this argument, should the US not intervene in the affairs of Sardinia? What are the two reasons that we're given to think that it's a bad idea? Well, one, it's illegal. Two, it's not going to work. And that's, super simple, right? But that is getting to the really core of it, right? That sort of is at the heart of it, why this shouldn't happen. All right, if that's right, why is it illegal? Well, it's illegal because there's this principle of national sovereignty. All right, why won't it work? Well, there's too mess of factions and grudges. What you've just done, again, none of this is how it was written in the original arguments, right? All of this is just me rewriting it, almost summarizing it for myself. What are the key claims here? Once you do that, everything's easy. What we basically just did is we almost like made the map that we're going to use for our diagramming. Now we just have to sort of figure out what corresponds in the original argument to the things that we just wrote out. So do the standardization. Standardization step is still easy, still same as it ever was. Begin by putting the conclusion at the bottom. The United States should not intervene in the affairs of Sardinia. Then for the standardization, just write the premises in the order that you see them. So first premise I see, it would be illegal. Second premise that I see, legally speaking, the principle of national sovereignty, yada, yada, yada. You can feel free to ... it if you want. You can yada, yada, yada. That's fine. You don't have to, for some of these, the sentences are going to get quite long. You don't have to necessarily write the whole thing down. Just make sure you're making it clear to me what sentence you're referring to. Go to 3. Just the next premise we see, the situation in Sardinia is a mess of factions and grudges. And then finally, the fourth one we see, intervention would not make a positive difference in such conflicts. All right. So notice that the standardization actually doesn't give us that much information, really, compared to what we've already said. Right? Here, we just listed the premises in order. We haven't really made it clear how any of these premises are related to one another. That's what the diagramming is for. That's why the diagramming is useful. So let's now go to the whiteboard and do the diagram. All right, so we've got our conclusion. And we said, what are the reasons to think that this conclusion is true? Well, intervention's not going to work, and intervention's illegal. All right, so what premise matches up with intervention's illegal? That seems like number 1. Right? What one matches up with intervention is not going to work? That seems to be a lot like 4. 4 seems to basically be saying it won't work. And then we stop. These are the primary premises. These are the reasons to believe that the conclusion is true. What about 2 and 3? Well, they seem to be give us reasons to believe that these premises are true. So they are subordinate premises as part of a subordinate argument. So we can say, what reason do we have for believing that it would be illegal? What was this whole principle of national sovereignty thing? That seems to be the second premise. That was what that second premise was about. So that second premise gives us a reason to believe that it's illegal. And why is it independent? Well, because it's by itself. And if you ever have a premise by itself, it's got to be independent, right? There's nothing for it to link to. Similarly, what reason did we have for believing that intervention wasn't going to work? Well, it's not going to work because the situation is a mess of factions and grudges. And that corresponds to 3. So again, 3 gives us a reason to believe that 4 is true. And then how are 1 and 4 related to each other? Well, okay, is the fact that intervention would be illegal a reason to not do it? Yep, that seems like a reason to not do something, is that it's illegal. Independent. Is the fact that intervention is not going to work a reason to not do it? Yep, something not working is a reason to not do it. So here's our diagram. And now we've really carefully articulated the structure that this argument has. We see how the premises relate to one another. We also see how the premises relate to the conclusion. So that's our first example of a more difficult problem. Does anyone have any questions, thoughts, comments, anything you want to go over with that harder one? All right, great. Then let's call it for today right there. What we'll do on Thursday is I'm just going to give you 5 hard ones. Right. So you can just practice with your group on those 5, and then we'll go over it together again. And also, I'm going to give you actually a sheet of hints if your group is having trouble with them. And I'm also going to give your group the answers. So I'm going to give you all of them. So I want you to really, you all working this out with one another will be way more helpful than me lecturing through it again. So I'm going to try to give you everything. I'm going to give you even longer to work on it than I did today. So your group can really work through it with the answers, with the hints, everything, so that you all can, help each other get really good at these. All right. Thank you all very much. I'll see you all on Thursday. Have a good rest of the week. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a quick question for you.
Sure, go ahead.
I'm having trouble getting the diagrams on my group activity. I drew them on paper and I tried uploading them, but it won't show up.
Let's see. So some people have actually taken a photo of things on their phones and added it into those image boxes in the activity. I know students have had success with that. What you could also do, I've seen a lot of students do this. So let's use this as the example. Do it just with pure text. So I've seen students do something like C one for little up dash or whatever to indicate that it's independent.
Oh, gotcha.
Another little dash to both of
All right,
them.
maybe I'll try that. Yeah.
So I've seen students do this, and I'm fine with it. Basically, just so long as it's clear to me what you mean. That's the only thing I'll be looking for.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. Have a good one.
Thanks, you too.